On the cold, quiet night of February 24th, 1978, five young men got into a car and vanished. They didn't crash. They weren't drunk. They weren't running from the law. They simply disappeared. Their names were Ted Weir, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, Jack Madruga, and Gary Mathias, close friends from Yuba City, California. They weren't troublemakers or thrill seekers. In fact, they were gentle, polite, and deeply bonded through shared struggles. All five had intellectual or mental health challenges, yet they found joy and purpose in the simplest of things: family, faith, basketball, and each other. That Friday evening, they left to watch a basketball game in Chico, 2 hours away. They were excited. Their own team, the Gateway Gators, was scheduled to play the next morning in a regional tournament. Winning meant a free trip to Los Angeles. It was supposed to be one of the best weekends of their lives. But they never made it home. Days passed. Their families panicked. Police searched. Rumors began to swirl. Then weeks passed. Then months. When the truth finally began to surface, it wasn't in the form of answers, but corpses. The first body was discovered in June, then another, and another. Their remains were scattered across the wilderness, some huddled under blankets, others with their flesh torn by animals, one lying alone in a forest trailer surrounded by untouched food and fuel. And Gary Mathias, he was never found. It didn't make sense. None of it did. Their car was discovered 70 miles away from the route they were supposed to take, perfectly parked, undamaged, with gas still in the tank. They left it behind and wandered deep into snow-covered woods in the dead of night for no clear reason. Why would five men abandon a working vehicle in freezing weather? Why didn't they use the food, the heater, or the supplies in the trailer they found? What were they running from or running toward? This case would soon gain a new name among those who heard of it: America's Dyatlov Pass incident, a haunting echo of the infamous Soviet mystery where 9 experienced hikers perished under similarly bizarre conditions. And just like Dyatlov, the questions here only multiply. The answers, if they exist, are buried somewhere in the snow and silence of California's Plumas National Forest. In this video, we will piece together the timeline, explore every clue, and ask the questions no one dares to answer out loud. This is the story of the Yuba County Five. Before the mystery, before the wilderness, before the tragedy, there were just 5 young men, friends, sons, brothers, each with a life of his own, dreams to chase, and a quiet innocence that made what happened to them all the more devastating. Theodore Ted Weir was the oldest of the group. At 32 years old, Ted had the mind of a child, but those who knew him described him as endlessly kind, gentle, and trusting. He found joy in little things, like making phone calls to read off funny names from the phone book to his best friend Bill. He had recently quit his job at a snack bar because the pressure was too much for him, but he never let go of his childlike optimism. Bill Sterling, also 32, was deeply religious and soft-spoken. He rarely left his house except to go to church, basketball, or his vocational program. He often visited patients at the local hospital to read them Bible verses, hoping to comfort strangers with the same quiet strength he gave to his friends. He and Ted shared a unique bond, 2 men with childlike hearts, navigating a world that often misunderstood them. Jack Hewitt, at just 24, was perhaps the most reserved of them all. He struggled with speech and had difficulty responding to strangers. But when he was with his close friends, especially Ted Weir, he lit up. They were inseparable. Ted often protected Jack like an older brother, even making phone calls on his behalf when needed. Jack Madruga, 29, was a U.S. Army veteran, discharged after a medical evaluation. Though he was never officially diagnosed with any intellectual disability, those around him described him as slow. But he was independent, proud, and careful. He had a driver's license, and he loved nothing more than driving his prized Mercury Montego around town. His friends trusted him behind the wheel, and he never let them down. And then there was Gary Mathias. At 25, Gary stood out in the group. He had been diagnosed with paranoid schizophrenia following a drug-related breakdown during his military service in Germany. But with regular medication and support, Gary was doing well. He worked for his stepfather's landscaping business, stayed active, and was considered high-functioning compared to the others. He was also the only one never found. All five were part of the Gateway Gators, a basketball team formed through their vocational rehabilitation center. Basketball gave them joy, structure, and a sense of purpose. The night they disappeared, they had just watched a game, excited to play in their own tournament the next day. If they won, they'd go to the Special Olympics in Los Angeles. For them, that meant everything. But they never made it to the court. Instead, they became part of a tragedy that would haunt their families and all of America for decades to come. This wasn't just a missing persons case. This was the undoing of 5 lives that never should have ended the way they did. Friday, February 24th, 1978. The air was cold, the roads were slick, and 5 boys, Ted Weir, Bill Sterling, Jack Hewitt, Jack Madruga, and Gary Mathias, were excited. That evening, they packed into Jack Madruga's prized 1969 Mercury Montego and headed north to Chico State University. There was a basketball game to watch, Cal State Chico versus UC Davis. And for the Gateway Gators, it was more than just entertainment. It was a preview. The very next morning, they were scheduled to play in their own big tournament back home. If they won, they'd get a trip to Los Angeles to play in the Special Olympics. They'd been preparing for weeks. Their uniforms were already laid out at home. Their families were excited. So were they. Witnesses saw them at the game. They cheered. They laughed. They were completely themselves, just 5 close friends enjoying a night out. After the game, they stopped at a small store near the university just before closing time. They bought snacks, milk, soft drinks, a few Hostess pies. Nothing unusual, nothing hurried. Then they got back in the car and drove off into the night. That was the last confirmed sighting of them, alive. What happened next remains one of the strangest mysteries in American true crime. Instead of heading south toward Yuba City, back the way they came, the Mercury Montego was later discovered 70 miles away, on a desolate, snow-covered mountain road in Plumas National Forest. It wasn't on the way home. In fact, it was in the complete opposite direction. When search teams found the car days later, it was perfectly parked, no damage. No signs of struggle. The keys were missing, but there was still a quarter tank of gas, more than enough to get them back home. Inside the car were the snack wrappers and the maps still folded neatly in the glove box. It was as if they had just stepped out and vanished. Why did they take that road? Had someone else been with them? Were they chased, coerced, or simply confused? Authorities initially speculated they may have taken a wrong turn, but none of the boys were familiar with that area. And the Montego wasn't stuck. It could have been reversed easily, yet they left it behind and struck out into the woods in sub-freezing temperatures with no proper clothing, no survival gear, and no clear destination. And that single decision would seal their fate. What followed was a descent into mystery, fear, and ultimately death, one that still haunts investigators, locals, and families to this day. Because that night something happened, and no one knows why. Just off the trail from his body lay the scattered bones of Bill Sterling, his remains dragged across the forest floor by scavengers. Clothing fragments and forensic analysis confirmed it was him. 2 days later, Jack Hewitt's father ignored police warnings and joined the search himself. What he found, no parent should ever have to see: a pair of Levi's jeans, a spine, and then his son's skull. The 4th boy had been found. That left one, Gary Mathias. Only his shoes were ever recovered, inside the trailer where Ted Weir died. Investigators believe he may have swapped his own for Ted's larger pair when frostbite began to ravage his feet. They suspect he was there and then gone, into the woods, into the snow, into silence. Gary Mathias was never seen again. No one could explain why the boys didn't use the food, why they left the car, why they split up. And no one could understand the pain of the families who had to bury sons that died, not from violence or accident, but from something far more cruel: confusion, fear, and the bitter cold of a mystery that refuses to thaw. Sometimes a mystery becomes even more haunting, not because of what we find, but because of what we don't. As investigators pieced together what little they had, it became clear that something about this case didn't add up. In fact, nothing about it did. First, the car. Jack Madruga's 1969 Mercury Montego was found 70 miles off course in a location none of the boys were familiar with. The road it was parked on wasn't a main road. It was a remote mountain path used primarily by forest rangers and hunters. The vehicle showed no signs of damage. It wasn't stuck. It had gas. In fact, officers were able to hotwire it and drive it out with no issues. So why abandon it? The keys were gone, and inside snack wrappers were scattered, soda bottles half empty, as if the group had eaten casually before stepping out into sub-zero temperatures. Second, the trailer. Ted Weir died inside it, wrapped in blankets, his feet blackened from frostbite. But around him were stockpiles of food. Dozens of Army-issued ration cans were untouched in a cabinet only feet away. There were matches, there were paperbacks, there was even a propane tank that could have heated the trailer for weeks. But no one lit a match. No one opened the food locker. Weir had survived nearly 2 months, and yet he lay there, starving and freezing, surrounded by everything that could have saved him. Third, the behavior. These weren't reckless teenagers. They were men, some with military training. Gary Mathias had served in the Army. So had Madruga. If anyone knew how to survive in freezing conditions, it was them. Why didn't they build a fire? Why didn't they huddle together? Why did they scatter into the forest, alone, unprotected? Fourth, the separation. The bodies weren't found together. Madruga and Sterling were miles from the trailer. Hewitt's remains were closer, but still not nearby. Only Weir died inside. Gary Mathias vanished altogether. Did they split up to find help? Or were they fleeing something or someone? And then there were the witness accounts. A man named Joseph Shones, who had been stuck on that same road the night they vanished, reported seeing strange figures outside his car around 2 a.m. Several men and a woman holding a baby. When he called out for help, they silently turned and vanished into the darkness. Hours later, he saw lights again and heard whistling in the woods. It sounded like a bad dream. But what if it wasn't? Something led those 5 men into the forest. Something made them leave safety, abandon logic, and walk into their deaths. But what? Until we know that, the Yuba County Five will remain one of the most unsettling mysteries in American history. Sometimes a mystery becomes even more haunting, not because of what we find, but because of what we don't. As investigators pieced together what little they had, it became clear that something about this case didn't add up. In fact, nothing about it did. First, the car. Jack Madruga's 1969 Mercury Montego was found 70 miles off course in a location none of the boys were familiar with. The road it was parked on wasn't a main road. It was a remote mountain path used primarily by forest rangers and hunters. The vehicle showed no signs of damage. It wasn't stuck. It had gas. In fact, officers were able to hotwire it and drive it out with no issues. So why abandon it? The keys were gone, and inside snack wrappers were scattered, soda bottles half empty, as if the group had eaten casually before stepping out into sub-zero temperatures. Second, the trailer. Ted Weir died inside it, wrapped in blankets, his feet blackened from frostbite. But around him were stockpiles of food. Dozens of Army-issued ration cans were untouched in a cabinet only feet away. There were matches, there were paperbacks, there was even a propane tank that could have heated the trailer for weeks. But no one lit a match. No one opened the food locker. Weir had survived nearly 2 months, and yet he lay there, starving and freezing, surrounded by everything that could have saved him. Third, the behavior. These weren't reckless teenagers. They were men, some with military training. Gary Mathias had served in the Army. So had Madruga. If anyone knew how to survive in freezing conditions, it was them. Why didn't they build a fire? Why didn't they huddle together? Why did they scatter into the forest, alone, unprotected? Fourth, the separation. The bodies weren't found together. Madruga and Sterling were miles from the trailer. Hewitt's remains were closer, but still not nearby. Only Weir died inside. Gary Mathias vanished altogether. Did they split up to find help? Or were they fleeing something or someone? And then there were the witness accounts. A man named Joseph Shones, who had been stuck on that same road the night they vanished, reported seeing strange figures outside his car around 2 a.m. Several men and a woman holding a baby. When he called out for help, they silently turned and vanished into the darkness. Hours later, he saw lights again and heard whistling in the woods. It sounded like a bad dream. But what if it wasn't? Something led those 5 men into the forest. Something made them leave safety, abandon logic, and walk into their deaths. But what? Until we know that, the Yuba County Five will remain one of the most unsettling mysteries in American history. The facts didn't make sense. So naturally, people started filling the silence with speculation. Some of those theories sounded like they came straight out of horror fiction. Others, it sounded disturbingly possible. One of the earliest whispers was murder, that the boys had seen something they weren't supposed to. According to an anonymous online post decades later, a woman claiming to be Jack Hewitt's sister-in-law said the boys had witnessed a violent altercation after the basketball game, something involving a woman being attacked by a group of men. She claimed that Gary Mathias had stepped in to help, leading to a confrontation. In the chaos, Mathias was allegedly thrown off a bridge. The others fled in panic, driving up into the mountains, desperate to escape whoever had attacked them. It sounded far-fetched, but there were gun casings found near the road where the Mercury Montego was discovered, something that was left out of many reports at the time. Another witness, Joseph Shones, the man who had a mild heart attack that same night and was stranded in his car, reported seeing strange lights, hearing whistling, and spotting a group of people outside in the dark. Several men and a woman holding a baby. Why would a woman with a baby be out in the snowy forest at 2 a.m.? Why didn't she help when he called out? The encounter is surreal, but if true, it suggests the boys weren't alone out there. Then came the paranoia. Some believe Gary Mathias, who suffered from paranoid schizophrenia, might have had a psychotic episode and convinced his friends to flee into the woods. But there's no evidence he was unstable at the time. His medication was working, and he was living a normal, functional life. Even so, mental illness can be unpredictable. More fringe theories took hold over the years. Alien abduction, military experiments, government cover-ups. It's easy to dismiss these, but when logic fails, the mind clings to anything. And then there's the most haunting theory of all. They were hiding. Investigators wondered if the boys didn't touch the food, didn't start a fire, didn't turn on the propane, because they didn't want to be found. But found by who? If they were fleeing someone or something, it would explain the silence, the darkness, the separation, the fear. Maybe they thought the trailer wasn't a shelter, but a trap. Or maybe their minds, already fragile, were consumed by cold, panic, and fear, until they could no longer tell up from down, friend from enemy, life from death. Whatever the truth is, it died with them. And the only one who might still hold the answers, Gary Mathias, vanished into the trees, leaving nothing behind but his shoes and silence. What really happened in the woods that night? No one knows, and maybe no one ever will. 5 young men left home that night with nothing but excitement in their hearts. They were going to watch a game, laugh together, eat snacks, come home, sleep, wake up and play their own match the next morning. That was the plan. Instead, their lives ended in the most tragic, confusing, and inexplicable way. To this day, we still don't know why. Why did they drive 70 miles in the wrong direction? Why abandon a perfectly working car in the middle of the night on a road none of them knew? Why walk miles into freezing mountains with no jackets, no plan, and no supplies? Why did Ted Weir stay in the trailer, starving to death, when there was food all around him? Why didn't anyone light a fire or turn on the propane heater that sat right outside the wall? Why were Bill and Jack's bodies found so far from shelter, alone? And why was Gary Mathias never found? Was it fear that led them into the trees? Was someone or something chasing them? Were they running from a crime or running towards someone who promised them help? Or was it something more tragic, more human? A moment of confusion, a misjudged decision, a cold night that robbed them of reason. And still we ask, did Gary Mathias survive out there? Did he bury his friends and walk away? Or did he fall to the same silent fate, in a place no one has searched? More than 4 decades have passed, but the pain hasn't dulled. For the families, there were no final words, no closure, only frozen ground and unspoken prayers. This wasn't just a mystery, it was a heartbreak wrapped in snow, shadow, and silence. And so we leave you with the question that haunts everyone who's ever heard this story. What really happened to the boys from Yuba City? And why did no one come back?